The sun had just begun its steady climb over the quiet suburban neighborhood, spilling golden light over trimmed hedges, evenly painted mailboxes, and the freshly paved asphalt of the cul-de-sac. It was the sort of neighborhood that looked as though it had been plucked straight from a glossy real estate brochure. Cookie-cutter houses, two-car garages, and neighbors who always pretended everything was perfect. But beneath that picture-perfect exterior, I knew something darker simmered. For months, I had observed the peculiar antics of the Homeowners Association, or rather, a self-appointed extension of it, people who seemed to think they had more power than they really did. And now, standing at my door that morning, their performance had reached a level so absurd, it felt like satire. It began with 3 sharp, commanding knocks that rattled the front door, the kind of knock designed to intimidate. When I opened it, I found 2 men standing on the porch. Both wore navy blue uniforms, patches stitched on their sleeves and badges that glinted in the sunlight. On the surface, they were dressed like law enforcement, but the details gave them away. Crooked patches, dollar store quality belts, and name tags that looked like they'd been laminated at home. They announced, with all the self-importance of small-time tyrants, that they were part of the HOA Police department. Their claim was that I had violated multiple ordinances of the neighborhood, infractions as vague as leaving my trash can out for longer than the approved window, not trimming a particular hedge to regulation height, and allegedly parking my vehicle in unauthorized areas. Of course, I knew the truth. There was no such thing as an HOA police department. At best, an HOA could fine residents or send out passive-aggressive letters. They couldn't dispatch fake officers to someone's doorstep and threaten arrest. And yet here they were, puffing out their chests, one of them carrying a cheap-looking pair of handcuffs, the other wielding a clipboard filled with forms that appeared copied and pasted from a free online template. For most people, the situation might have been terrifying. The sight of uniforms, the tone of authority, and the threat of handcuffs would have been enough to force compliance. That was the reaction they were counting on. But what they didn't know was who they were standing in front of. I wasn't just another homeowner on their list. I was a federal agent trained in deception, investigation, and the art of dismantling fraudulent operations. I played it calm. Years of undercover work had taught me to control my face, to betray nothing of what I truly knew. I let them lecture me, their voices swelling with each absurd accusation. They spoke of overdue HOA court dates that didn't exist, of bylaws that were never passed, and of supposed neighborhood complaints that seemed more like personal vendettas. Behind their words, I could hear the arrogance of entitlement. These were not law enforcement officers. They were neighbors, or at least locals, who had appointed themselves as enforcers, likely emboldened by a Karen-style ringleader who thrived on control. Every neighborhood had one, the person who patrolled with a clipboard, who documented every minor offense, and who believed that their opinion outweighed logic, legality, and common sense. As they spoke, I noticed small but telling details. Their radios weren't functional, plastic toys, static silent. Their boots didn't match regulation standards, one laced with bright red string. The official patches bore the words Community Patrol, but the stitching was uneven, curling at the edges. They were amateurs playing dress-up, convinced they could manipulate fear into power. I listened, nodded, and asked no questions, letting them believe they were in control. In reality, I was cataloging everything: their physical descriptions, the serial number scratched onto the fake cuffs, the specific language they used. They referred repeatedly to head command, an obvious reference to someone higher up in this faux organization. Whoever it was, that was the real orchestrator, the puppet master of this ridiculous scheme. When they declared I was under neighborhood arrest for repeated noncompliance, I almost laughed. Instead, I allowed them to gesture dramatically, even stepping 1 foot across the threshold as though daring me to resist. What they didn't realize was that by doing so, they had just crossed into attempted unlawful entry. Another note for the report I would be filing later, though not in the way they expected. I didn't reveal anything about my true occupation. That card would be played later at the right moment when their entire act would collapse under the weight of reality. For now, I simply told them I would need to review their citations before signing anything. The taller one hesitated, clearly not prepared for pushback. The shorter one muttered something about contacting their supervisor, their commander of the HOA Enforcement Division, and just like that they retreated, leaving a poorly printed notice taped to my door. The paper contained all the hallmarks of amateur forgery, clip art badges, bold red fonts, and phrasing so over the top it bordered on parody. It warned of escalating fines, mandatory compliance hearings, and bizarrely potential jail time in the neighborhood detention center when their vehicle pulled away, a battered minivan with magnetic stickers slapped on the side that read HOA. Police! I finally allowed myself to exhale. Not out of fear, but out of anticipation. This was bigger than two wannabe enforcers. This was an operation, a conspiracy within the neighborhood meant to instill fear and obedience. And as of that morning, they had made the mistake of targeting the wrong house. I knew I couldn't act impulsively. To dismantle this, I needed to gather evidence, identify the ringleaders, and understand the scope of their scheme. Were they extorting neighbors for money under the guise of fines? Were they intimidating people into submission? Or was this a Karen-driven crusade to control every inch of the neighborhood, from lawn heights to mailbox paint colors? That night, I watched from my office window as the faux patrol car circled the block, headlights sweeping across driveways. They stopped at a neighbor's house 3 doors down, slipping another notice under the door. The pattern was clear. They were blanketing the community, targeting anyone who defied their made-up authority. I began logging their movements, recording times, dates, and locations. Every detail mattered. By the end of the week, I had built a timeline of their operations, along with photos of their uniforms, their fake car, and their so-called paperwork. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. The heart of the scheme resided in one house. A large 2-story with blindingly white shutters, manicured hedges, and a porch that looked more like a throne than an entryway. That house belonged to her. The Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA president, though records showed she had never been elected through any legitimate process. She had instead bullied her way into the role, scaring others into compliance and silencing those who objected. She was the spider at the center of this web, and the 2 fake officers at my door had been nothing more than pawns. But I wasn't about to confront her yet. This wasn't just about standing my ground. It was about exposing the entire charade, making sure the neighborhood saw the truth, and ensuring no one else became a victim of their intimidation. And when the time came, I would reveal who I really was. For now, I prepared. The files were building, the evidence mounting. What had started as a laughable attempt to scare me with fake handcuffs was evolving into a full-blown investigation. The HOA police thought they had chosen an easy target. But in reality, they had walked straight into the trap of someone trained to dismantle operations exactly like theirs. The quiet of the neighborhood was an illusion. Behind closed doors, lines were being drawn, sides were being chosen, and a storm was brewing. And I was ready to meet it head-on. As the clock ticked past midnight, I closed my blinds, saved my notes, and prepared for what was to come. This was only the beginning. Because the next time they came to my door, I wouldn't just be observing, I would be ready to strike. The morning after the first encounter with the so-called HOA Police Department, the neighborhood felt different. On the surface, it was the same as ever. Lawns trimmed with near-military precision, sprinklers misting over sidewalks, and the occasional jogger moving past with earbuds in. But beneath that calm exterior, I could feel the ripple of fear. The fabricated authority of those 2 fake officers was spreading, like a weed taking root in soil that had been quietly poisoned for months. My training had conditioned me to notice subtle changes in behavior, the micro-expressions and hesitations that most people would overlook. And in my neighbors, I saw the signs. A woman down the street rushed to pull her trash can back into her garage, casting anxious glances at the road as though expecting another patrol car to roll past. A father and son who often played basketball in their driveway had gone silent, their hoop dismantled and lying in pieces beside the garage. Another family, known for their elaborate seasonal decorations, had stripped their yard bare, leaving behind only a stark lawn, as if afraid any form of self-expression might draw unwanted attention. The strategy of the fake HOA police was clear: fear through visibility. They didn't need actual authority. They only needed neighbors to believe they had it. By driving their sticker-covered minivan in circles, flashing their toy radios and waving their bogus citations, they could convince people compliance was the only option. But I wasn't going to be part of that charade. I began my counter-operation quietly. Every evening I walked the neighborhood under the guise of casual exercise. A water bottle in hand, headphones around my neck, I looked like any other resident trying to unwind. In reality, I was mapping patterns. I logged the times the fake officers appeared, noting how long they lingered at certain houses and which residents they targeted most. The more I studied, the clearer the hierarchy became. At the top sat the self-proclaimed HOA president, the Karen of all Karens. Her pristine house was the command center, and I observed multiple meetings taking place on her porch, gatherings of neighbors who had either bought into her delusion or been pressured into acting as her loyal followers. These weren't just casual chats. She distributed clipboards, maps of the neighborhood, and folders that looked suspiciously like dossiers on residents. It was amateur surveillance, but with just enough structure to intimidate. Her enforcers, the two men who had appeared at my door, were not operating alone. By the end of the week, I identified at least 4 others assisting them. One was a woman in her 50s who carried a whistle and notebook, trailing behind the patrols as though documenting offenses. Another was a tall teenager, barely out of high school, who seemed thrilled by the power trip of wearing a reflective vest and shouting at younger kids who dared ride skateboards down the sidewalk. There was also an older man, retired military, judging by his posture and gait, who wore a fake badge around his neck and treated his golf cart as an official vehicle, complete with flashing amber lights installed on top. Together, they formed a parody of a law enforcement unit, but the neighborhood wasn't laughing. People were scared. And that fear was being used as a weapon. I needed more than casual observation, so I staged my first test. On garbage collection day, I deliberately left my trash can on the curb a few hours longer than the HOA regulations supposedly allowed. I made no attempt to hide it, and then I waited. Sure enough, by mid-afternoon, the minivan rolled up. The same 2 fake officers from before stepped out, one already flipping open his clipboard, the other twirling the plastic handcuffs in an exaggerated display. They took photos of the trash can, circled something on their papers, and taped another notice to my door. This time, the language was harsher. "Final warning," it read in bold red letters. It threatened not just fines, but escalated action should I continue my defiance. What they didn't realize was that I had set up a camera behind a window, recording everything. The fake badges, the phony documents, the over-the-top theatrics, all of it was captured in high definition. Evidence for later, but I also noticed something else that day. Across the street, a neighbor peeked out through her curtains, her face pale and tight with worry. She saw the fake officers at my door and quickly vanished from view. Moments later, I saw her husband in the yard, hurriedly repainting the mailbox post as though trying to preempt whatever accusation might come next. Fear had turned into obedience. That was when I understood the true danger. This wasn't just about annoying Karen behavior or petty fines. This was psychological warfare. By making themselves visible and aggressive, the fake HOA police had created a climate of compliance. People were surrendering not because they believed in the rules, but because they feared the consequences of standing out. I couldn't let that continue. My next step was infiltration. If Karen was running her operation like a miniature dictatorship, then she'd need constant communication with her enforcers. And sure enough, after a few days of observation, I caught sight of the system, a private group chat on their phones. During one of their porch meetings, I managed to get close enough, while pretending to jog past, to see the app they were using. It wasn't anything sophisticated, just a basic messaging app renamed to something laughable like Neighborhood Command. Later that night, using tools from my line of work, I traced the group's activity. They sent updates about offenses, photos of supposed violations, and even bragged about scaring certain families into submission. The language they used was revealing. They weren't just pretending to be police. They actually believed they were restoring order to a neighborhood under siege by rule breakers. But behind the self-righteous tone was something more sinister: money. Hidden in the threads were discussions of fines, amounts owed, and demands for cash payments to avoid further action. Some families had already paid, out of fear or desperation, and guess where the money was going? Straight into a personal account linked to Karen. This wasn't just cosplay authority. This was fraud. I now had both motive and method. The fake HOA police were a front for extortion, using fear of enforcement to line the pockets of their leader. What they didn't know was that every message, every fraudulent notice, every stage patrol was evidence piling up against them. But exposing them required patience. If I moved too quickly, they'd retreat and vanish before I could make the case airtight. So I let them keep circling, keep posting their fake notices, keep gathering money. I let them dig their own hole deeper because when the truth came out, I wanted there to be no escape. Still, the situation grew more volatile by the day. One evening, as I documented their golf cart patrol, I saw them confront a family who had dared to leave a bicycle leaning against their garage. The fake officers berated them in front of their children, threatening to confiscate the bike if it wasn't moved immediately. The little boy burst into tears, clutching his handlebars while his parents scrambled to comply. That was the moment my professional instincts sharpened into something more personal. These weren't just nuisances. They were bullies, and they were terrorizing innocent families who lacked the resources or the courage to fight back. The final straw came a week later, when a new notice appeared at my door. This one wasn't a warning. It was an arrest order. According to the paper, the HOA Police would be arriving within 48 hours to take me into custody for repeated violations and failure to comply with neighborhood law. To anyone else, it might have been terrifying. To me, it was an invitation, because when they came back, I wouldn't just be recording them. I would be ready to end the charade once and for all. They gave me 48 hours. The printed paper on my door wasn't a threat so much as an ultimatum, a flourish of red type and official-sounding language meant to suffocate any last embers of resistance. The HOA arrest order read like a mockery, formally pronounced but hollow, an inventory of alleged offenses compiled with the kind of zealotry only entitlement can manufacture. It declared that the HOA police would arrive to detain me, to escort me to a compliance hearing, and to administer punitive measures for my alleged violations. Whoever had drafted it had imagined scenes from courtroom dramas and assigned me the role of a villain. The neighborhood seemed to recoil. Neighbors glanced at my house with the furtive curiosity reserved for someone facing scandal. Kids who used to wave from bicycles now crossed the street to avoid me. The distance was small and petty, but it underscored the power of perception. When a piece of paper could turn a neighbor into a pariah, the mechanism of control was complete. But perception wasn't reality. The paperwork was a prop. The minivan and its stickers were theater. And I had waited for this moment for a reason. I had watched, documented, infiltrated, and built a case in silence. If they were going to attempt an arrest, they were also choosing to act in plain view. And that was a mistake. On the morning they chose, the neighborhood hummed like a beehive. It felt like someone had hit the X on normal life, and everything was buzzing with the anticipation of watching a spectacle, an execution of petty justice carried out under the banner of fake authority. The HOA minivan rolled up first, creeping like a stagecoach, followed by the golf cart with its blinking amber lights. The enforcers spilled out from porches like actors making an entrance. Their faces were set, their gestures practiced. They relished the attention. They approached my house with pomp, their leader striding ahead with that particular brand of self-satisfaction that belongs to people who believe the world owes them compliance. The two men who had first come to my door took the lead, clipboards clutched to their chests, as though the weight of statecraft depended on those sheets of paper. The whistle-woman hovered at the perimeter, ready to call for backup if I showed resistance. The teenager and the retired military man completed the tableau, ready to enforce whatever theater their leader had scripted that day. They knocked. I opened the door. They declared, with all the seriousness of a community theater troupe, that I was under arrest. They read from a list of infractions in a voice that seemed rehearsed, as if the words would magically activate the authority they lacked. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors, drawn by curiosity and the allure of watching the decline of a defiant house. Cameras and phones appeared, recording, streaming, broadcasting. The performance was underway. This was their moment. It should have been their triumph. Instead, it became their undoing. I played the part they expected, polite but firm, mildly inconvenienced at the disruption to my morning. I asked for identification. I requested to see the legal authority that allowed them to detain a resident. The taller of the two flinched at my question, the first crack in the facade. The shorter one started to reach for his radio, a plastic toy that had been positioned as the sound of legitimacy. Instead of compliance, I asked a direct and simple question about jurisdiction and a citation for their authority. Their answers were evasive, patched together with legal-sounding phrases lifted from internet forums and HOA blogs. The whistle-woman, sensing discomfort, stepped forward to assert that the neighborhood had voted them into power. The retired man spoke of tradition, and the teenager shouted that they were keeping our streets safe. Their words were a jumble of moralizing rhetoric, meant to drown out legal scrutiny. But the problem for them was that I wasn't a scared homeowner. I was an investigator. And investigating meant listening for the places where stories failed to line up. It wasn't long before their story began to unravel. While one of them tried to read a bogus warrant, a neighbor in the crowd, a woman whose mailbox I'd documented being repainted under duress, quietly stepped forward and corrected their version of events. She had refused to pay their so-called fines, she said, and they had retaliated. Another neighbor, emboldened by the presence of phones, described how the fake officers had threatened to remove a child's bicycle. The whispers became statements. The statements became confessions. The crowd shifted from spectators to witnesses. That was when I made my move. I stepped out into the street, into the center of the performance, and I spoke. Not to them, but to the people around us, to the cameras flashing in their pockets. I told the story of the notices, the staged patrols, the extortion scheme I had traced to the HOA president. I explained in calm, measured tones the photographic evidence I had collected, the transaction records that linked fines to a private account, and the messages I had intercepted that described their scheme in their own words. My voice cut through the murmurs like a blade, and for the first time the neighborhood heard the other side of the story. A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Phones lifted, not to record the arrest, but to capture a different scene. The leader's face blanching, the enforcer's eyes flicking toward one another. They were caught between the theater of authority and the reality of being exposed. The retired man's jaw clenched. The teenager looked down at his feet. The two who had first come to my door shuffled their papers like children trying to hide a cheat sheet. That's when I revealed a card that had been kept in reserve, a card you never play unless you're prepared for the consequences. I pulled up my badge, not shouted or brandished it, but presented it carefully so all could see. The words on its face were official and unambiguous. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The effect was instant, seismic. Phone cameras trembled in shaky hands. People took a step back, as though moving away from an oncoming train. The leader stammered the term HOA president, sounding suddenly small and ridiculous in the presence of a federal seal. I did not shout, did not issue threats, did not swagger. My training taught me restraint and the power of clarity. I explained what their actions constituted: impersonation, fraud, extortion, coercion. I described the elements of a criminal scheme, how the fake citations constituted forgery, how the fines were pocketed proceeds, and how the arrests were criminal acts in themselves. I spoke slowly, knowing that every syllable landed like a verdict in the ears of those who had been coerced into believing otherwise. The leader tried to recover. She insisted she had only been looking out for the neighborhood. She tried to frame her actions as civic-mindedness, but the words fell hollow against the evidence and the weight of federal authority. The men who had performed the arrest looked smaller now, as if their costumes had shrunk with each word I spoke. One of them tried to say it had been misunderstood, but the cameras had caught him. His toy cuffs, his fake badge, his penchant for theatrics. My reveal was not an end, but a pivot. I needed to secure evidence, to ensure the scheme could not simply be rebranded and resurrected under a different name. I requested that the enforcers hand over their paperwork and their devices. The teenager clutched his phone to his chest like contraband. The whistlewoman attempted to make a show of compliance, but slipped and handed over a notebook full of scribbled threats and lists of offenders. The retired man, oddly silent, opened a small case and removed a bundle of receipts and a ledger. Cash payments, dates, names. As each physical document changed hands, their options shrank. What had been posturing became proof. The garden variety bravado of a neighborhood vigilante group was exposed as a ledger of illegal transactions. The minivan's magnetic sticker, the amber lights on the golf cart, the toy radio, all artifacts in a case file that now had a spine. Neighbors watched as their own complicity, whether through fear or tacit acceptance, was transformed into a story they would have to reckon with. Some faces registered relief, others shame, and some anger, rage at being manipulated and frightened into compliance. A few tried to defend the leader, accusing me of overreach, of making a mountain out of a molehill. But the ledger, the messages, the receipts, and the recorded patrol footage did not care for arguments. Evidence has a gravity of its own. Before I left that day, I made sure of two things. First, I ensured that the documents taken from the enforcers were secured and logged. Second, and perhaps more importantly in terms of neighborhood healing, I spoke to those who had come forward, not as an authority figure delivering a verdict, but as someone asking for their names to be recorded as witnesses. The act of being asked to speak, to provide details, to be part of a legal record, was itself a salve. People who had been shamed into silence rediscovered their voices, and with those voices came the capacity to resist. The leader's house, once a theater for intimidation, sat like a stage emptied after the curtain call. Her followers dispersed, some in disgrace, others in denial. The minivan pulled away with a deflated dignity, its stickers suddenly absurd. The garden around the leader's porch, once immaculate with the manicured precision of someone who believed conformity equaled morality, looked ordinary now, a place where someone used to sitting in judgment had finally been seen for what she was, a person abusing influence for personal gain. I left the neighborhood that evening with a folder full of evidence, a list of witnesses, and a strange sense of relief. The immediate danger had been dissipated, but the work was not done. There would be legal procedures, depositions, and the slow business of justice. There would be fallout, lawsuits perhaps, and the unpleasantness of neighbors confronting the reality that people they had trusted had been exploiting them. But for the first time since the fake HOA Police had begun their campaign, the narrative had shifted. The fear that had once curdled the neighborhood into compliance had been replaced, at least for now, with the possibility of accountability. People could see that intimidation could be named and opposed, and that truth could outshine the most elaborate of performances. I closed my notebook and prepared the initial report. Not because I wanted credit, but because people deserved to live without the suffocating shadow of manufactured authority. The cameras continued to blink in the distance. The phones uploaded footage that would become evidence. The neighborhood, which had been a stage for petty cruelty, had been forced in public and humiliating terms to confront its own vulnerabilities. And though the curtain had fallen on their small play, the consequences were only beginning. The story would ripple outward, into courts, perhaps onto local news, and certainly through the houses of every neighbor who had been touched by the charade. The fight for normalcy had a long road ahead, but that day had been a watershed. As I drove away, federal badge tucked away, I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction. They had come to my door thinking they could intimidate me. They had tried to turn the neighborhood into a stage for petty authoritarianism. Instead, they had provided the evidence that would hold them accountable. The performance was over. The prosecution was just beginning. The performance had ended, but the echoes of it lingered long after. That staged arrest in front of my house had fractured the illusion the fake HOA Police had built, and when the cracks appeared, everything else started to break apart with it. The neighborhood, once subdued under a blanket of fear, was now restless. People whispered in driveways, huddled in small groups at the end of cul-de-sacs, and traded stories about fines, threats, and intimidation. For months, the self-appointed HOA president and her followers had seemed untouchable. But now that the curtain had been pulled back, everyone had a story to tell. And some of those stories were uglier than I had expected. Within 48 hours, videos of the attempted arrest began circulating on local social media pages. Grainy clips recorded from cell phones showed the fake officers marching up to my door, their plastic handcuffs glinting, their voices raised in threats. The footage caught the tremble in their hands when I asked for jurisdiction, the disbelief on their faces when I displayed my badge, and the moment the crowd shifted from compliance to skepticism. Neighbors who had once been silent now felt emboldened. Comments on community forums multiplied. Some shared their experiences of being fined hundreds of dollars for trivial offenses. A flower pot in the wrong color, a basketball hoop left visible, holiday decorations still up in February. Others admitted to paying compliance fees in cash, too afraid to demand receipts. The more stories emerged, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. It was running an extortion racket dressed up as neighborhood pride, but exposure alone didn't end the scheme. It just forced it to mutate. The self-styled president, the Karen who had orchestrated the HOA Police, did not retreat quietly. Instead, she doubled down. From her immaculate porch, she posted lengthy statements online, accusing me of exaggerating, of misrepresenting community service as criminal activity. She claimed the HOA Police had been a volunteer patrol meant to restore order after months of resident neglect. She dismissed the fake badges and toy radios as symbolic, meant only to encourage compliance through visibility. It was classic. Deflection, reframing intimidation as leadership, exploitation as responsibility. And surprisingly, a handful of neighbors still believed her. They defended her in the comments, claiming she had single-handedly kept the neighborhood clean and safe. Others accused me of overstepping, of bringing federal-level problems into what they insisted was a community matter. The result was division. Where fear had once united the neighborhood under submission, exposure now split it into factions. On one side were those who wanted accountability, who had grown weary of being manipulated and drained by fake fines. On the other were those who clung to the illusion of order, either out of denial or a misplaced belief that authoritarian control was better than freedom. In practical terms, the fallout grew quickly. Several neighbors stopped paying their fees, openly defying the president's notices. Her enforcers, what was left of them, still tried to patrol, but without the illusion of authority, they looked like actors without a stage. The retired man's golf cart still rolled, but children laughed at its flashing amber lights instead of hiding from it. The teenager's reflective vest became a joke, mocked openly by kids who had once feared him. But Karen was not a woman who let go easily. If fear no longer worked, she would find another lever. And the lever she chose was legal intimidation. Within a week, several families, including mine, received thick envelopes in the mail. Inside were legal documents announcing lawsuits filed on behalf of the HOA. The claims were absurd: defamation, harassment, interference with community governance. The documents were padded with pseudo-legal jargon, entire paragraphs copied and pasted from online templates. They carried no real weight, but they were designed to overwhelm, to scare people with the idea of being dragged into court. Most neighbors panicked. They had never seen a legal summons before, real or fake. Some rushed to comply again, sending money in hopes of avoiding escalation. Others went silent, afraid to become targets of the president's wrath. But I wasn't fooled. I knew the documents were forgeries. At best, frivolous filings meant to clog the system. At worst, outright fraud designed to extract more money. Still, perception mattered. And perception was shifting fast, because social media had amplified the story far beyond the confines of our cul-de-sac. Local news picked it up first, a quirky human interest story about fake police in a suburban neighborhood. But as soon as my FBI badge entered the narrative, the tone changed. Headlines shifted from HOA drama turns bizarre to federal agent exposes fraudulent HOA police scheme. Reporters parked at the entrance to the subdivision. Cameras rolled at town meetings, and the once private neighborhood became a spectacle. Karen, instead of retreating, basked in the attention. She gave interviews from her front porch, styled like a martyr under siege. She painted herself as a woman wronged, attacked for trying to uphold standards in a community plagued by laziness and non-compliance. Her words dripped with the righteous indignation of someone who believed rules existed for her to wield, not follow. And for every person who saw through her act, there was another who nodded along, convinced that her authoritarian crusade was justified. The tension was palpable. Driveways became front lines. Neighbors avoided each other or argued openly about loyalty and betrayal. Some families began talking about moving, unwilling to live in a place where community had collapsed into factions. Others dug in deeper, determined to fight until order, or at least their version of it, was restored. Meanwhile, the legal process had begun. With the evidence I had gathered, I initiated formal complaints. Impersonation of law enforcement, fraud, extortion, and harassment. Local authorities, embarrassed that such an operation had festered under their noses, reluctantly opened investigations. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and in the gap between exposure and accountability, chaos thrived. One evening, as I returned from work, I found my driveway spray-painted with the words "traitor" in thick red letters. My mailbox had been smashed, its fragments scattered across the curb. It was retaliation, desperate, sloppy, and furious. Neighbors whispered that the president's loyalists were escalating, lashing out at anyone who dared oppose her. The intimidation had lost its uniformed veneer, but it hadn't vanished. It had just gone underground. I filed the vandalism as evidence, adding it to the growing pile of misconduct. But I also knew it signaled a dangerous turn. The HOA Police had been theater, but this was something else. Anger stripped of pretense, anger that could escalate into violence. And though I had faced worse in my line of work, my concern was for the families who had no training, no resources, and no protection beyond locked doors and hope. The final blow to the president's illusion came not from law enforcement, but from within. A former ally, the whistle-woman with the notebook, quietly approached me one afternoon. She handed over pages filled with detailed notes, dates, times, amounts collected, names of families coerced into paying. She confessed she had grown uncomfortable with the scheme months ago, but had been too afraid to speak out. Watching the attempted arrest unravel had convinced her to defect. Her testimony was the missing piece. With her cooperation, the financial trail became undeniable. Every fake fine, every cash compliance payment, every dollar funneled into Karen's personal account was documented. The scheme was no longer speculation. It was a paper trail backed by witnesses and evidence, and yet even as the walls closed in, Karen remained defiant. She stood on her porch one last time, declaring that the neighborhood was falling apart without her leadership. She accused her former allies of betrayal, neighbors of ingratitude, and me of conspiracy. Her words, once sharp enough to cow a community, now sounded brittle, like glass fracturing under pressure. But fractured glass can still cut, and I knew the fight wasn't over. Legal proceedings were just beginning. Loyalties in the neighborhood remained divided. And anger, once unleashed, doesn't vanish overnight. That night, as I filed the whistle-woman's notes into my evidence binder, I realized the next chapter would not be about exposure. It would be about consequences. And consequences, I knew from experience, were rarely clean. The storm had broken, but the floodwaters were still rising. The neighborhood no longer looked like the glossy paradise it had once been sold as. The rows of identical houses, trimmed hedges, and pristine mailboxes now stood as silent witnesses to a war that had torn through their manicured streets. What had started as a performance with costumes and fake police badges had spiraled into lawsuits, retaliation, and televised drama. The HOA saga had become more than gossip. It had become a battle for the soul of the community. The morning of the first court hearing arrived with the same kind of tension that precedes a storm. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters near the subdivision entrance, whispering about who was going, who had been subpoenaed, and what the outcome might mean for property values. Some clung to hope that justice would restore peace. Others muttered bitterly about how outsiders had ruined their quiet lives, by which they meant me. I had no illusions about the day ahead. Legal proceedings are rarely glamorous. They are not about catharsis. They are about evidence, procedure, and persistence. I carried with me the binder of notes, receipts, photos, and testimonies I had compiled over weeks. It was heavy, not just in weight, but in significance. A tangible reminder of the lives manipulated by one woman's obsession with control. Inside the courthouse, the illusion of HOA authority dissolved under fluorescent lights and polished oak benches. The president sat at the defendant's table, posture stiff, eyes sharp. Gone was the smug grin she wore on her porch. Instead, her expression was one of brittle defiance, as though she still believed she could bend reality to her will if she projected confidence long enough. Her entourage was smaller now. The teenager had vanished, likely cut loose to avoid scrutiny. The whistle woman had defected entirely. The retired man remained at her side, his jaw clenched, a soldier without a cause but too stubborn to surrender. A few neighbors, still loyal, sat behind her as though their presence alone could tilt the scales. The case unfolded with methodical precision. The prosecutor laid out the charges: impersonation of law enforcement, fraud, extortion, harassment. Each charge was punctuated by evidence: photographs of fake uniforms, screenshots of group messages, testimony from residents. The whistle woman's notebook became a centerpiece, its detailed accounts woven into a narrative of calculated intimidation. When my turn came, I testified not as a neighbor but as a professional. I described the pattern of behavior, the mechanisms of control, the financial trail. I explained how fear had been manufactured, how authority had been faked, and how ordinary families had been coerced into paying money under threat of humiliation and fabricated punishment. The defense, led by an underqualified lawyer likely hired in desperation, tried to reframe the scheme as community self-regulation. They painted the president as a civic-minded leader overwhelmed by the laziness of her neighbors. They argued that the fake police were merely symbolic, a deterrent against disorder. But the words rang hollow against the evidence. Symbolic handcuffs don't come with arrest orders. Community service doesn't funnel cash into personal bank accounts. Still, the president played her role with conviction. She spoke of sleepless nights spent worrying about declining property values, of a neighborhood overrun by noncompliance, of a personal mission to restore standards. She cast herself as a victim of misunderstanding, a martyr punished for caring too much. Her voice trembled at the right moments, her eyes welled with tears that seemed almost convincing. Almost. Because for every tear she shed, there was a neighbor ready to stand and describe the fear she had inflicted. A father spoke of his son's bicycle being threatened with confiscation. A mother described crying after being told her seasonal decorations were ruining the street's reputation. An elderly resident admitted to paying hundreds in cash, terrified of being arrested in her own home. Each testimony chipped away at the veneer the president tried to maintain, revealing not devotion but domination. The courtroom became a mirror, reflecting back the community's truth. And that truth was not flattering. The neighborhood had not been a victim of neglect. It had been a victim of authoritarian delusion. The illusion of perfection had been maintained through coercion, not care. When the judge finally spoke, the words carried the weight of finality. The charges would proceed to trial. There was sufficient evidence to dismantle the fake HOA Police and hold its architect accountable. Bail was set, restrictions were imposed, and for the first time, the president's power slipped entirely from her grasp. But outside the courtroom, the war was far from over. The news cameras swarmed as we stepped onto the courthouse steps. Microphones were thrust forward, questions fired in rapid succession. Some reporters wanted the sensational, the FBI angle, the fake police uniforms, the absurdity of it all. Others wanted the human cost, the fear, the division, the families torn apart by one woman's obsession with control. The president, ever the performer, seized the cameras like a stage. She declared her innocence, denounced the proceedings as a witch hunt, and accused me personally of conspiring against her. Her words were laced with venom, her voice rising with each accusation. And though her claims held no merit, the cameras captured them all, broadcasting her defiance into living rooms far beyond the neighborhood's borders. The fallout at home grew more toxic by the day. The Loyalists clung to their narrative, plastering flyers across mailboxes that read, "Support your HOA president, don't let government destroy our community." They organized small gatherings, framing themselves as the true defenders of neighborhood values. The rhetoric grew sharper, angrier, tinged with the desperation of a dwindling faction unwilling to admit defeat. Meanwhile, the families who had testified faced retaliation. Lawns were vandalized, cars scratched, houses egged under cover of night. The message was clear. Loyalty was demanded, and dissent would be punished. The fake uniforms were gone, but the mindset remained, a cult of control that refused to die quietly. And through it all, I documented. Every act of vandalism, every threatening flyer, every social media post was added to the file. Because if the courtroom was where this battle would be fought, then every scrap of evidence mattered. Yet even as the legal noose tightened, I couldn't shake the feeling that the president had one last move left. People like her didn't fade into quiet resignation. They burned brightly until the very end, convinced that if they shouted loudly enough, reality itself would bend to their will. That suspicion proved correct. One evening, just weeks before the trial was set to begin, the neighborhood was jolted awake by flashing lights, not the amber glow of a golf cart, but the piercing red and blue of actual police cruisers. The president had called them herself, claiming that she was being harassed, that vigilantes were targeting her, that she was unsafe in her own home. She painted herself as a victim under siege, hoping to weaponize real authority where her fake version had failed. The irony was almost poetic. For months, she had played police. Now, facing real police, she tried to twist their power into her shield. But the officers weren't buying it. They had seen the evidence, heard the testimonies, and read the reports. Her performance found no audience this time. As the cruisers pulled away, the neighborhood exhaled a collective sigh. The charade was crumbling, her tactics exhausted. But even in defeat, her shadow lingered. Families still eyed each other with suspicion. Friendships had fractured, and trust was gone. The neighborhood had been scarred, perhaps permanently, by the war she had waged in the name of order. That night, as I filed my latest notes, I realized the neighborhood was no longer just a backdrop to the story. It had become the story itself, a cautionary tale of how quickly fear and entitlement can transform quiet streets into battlefields. And though the trial loomed ahead, I knew the verdict had already been written, not by a judge, but by the people who had lived through it. The HOA president had sought control, but what she had created was chaos. Her empire of fake authority was in ruins. All that remained was to see how loudly it would collapse. The weeks leading up to the trial felt like the quiet before a storm, not because the neighborhood was calm, far from it, but because the chaos had reached a point of exhaustion. Families walked quickly from their cars to their doors, avoiding eye contact with one another. Lawns, once a source of rivalry, now grew slightly overlong as people stopped caring about appearances. The fake HOA police were gone, their uniforms packed away or burned, but the shadow of their presence lingered like a bad memory. For me, it was about preparation. Every evening after work, I returned to my office and organized the evidence. Stacks of photographs, printed emails, bank statements, handwritten testimonies. Every piece was labeled, cross-referenced, ready to be called upon in the courtroom. I had been trained for cases far larger than this one, involving cartels and organized crime syndicates. Yet somehow, the pettiness of a suburban HOA power struggle carried its own kind of weight. This wasn't about drugs or guns, it was about neighbors, families, and the fragile illusion of community. The trial began on a gray Monday morning. The courthouse was crowded, not just with lawyers and reporters, but with residents who had lived under the president's thumb. Some came seeking closure. Others came out of morbid curiosity. eager to watch the collapse of a woman who had once ruled their cul-de-sac like a queen. When the president walked in, she carried herself with the same rigid posture she had worn for months. Her outfit was carefully chosen, modest but commanding, designed to suggest dignity even in the face of accusation. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on me with a mixture of hatred and calculation. She was not a woman resigned to defeat. She was still convinced she could win. The prosecution began by laying out the scheme in simple, damning terms. They showed the fake police badges, the handcuffs, the uniforms purchased online. They displayed screenshots of the HOA group chat where compliance patrols were coordinated. They presented the whistle-woman's notebook, detailing every dollar collected and every threat issued. Piece by piece, the illusion unraveled. Then came the testimonies. Residents took the stand, one after another, each recounting their experiences. A father described being fined for his son's basketball hoop, threatened with police action if it wasn't removed. A mother told the jury how she had been forced to hand over cash in an envelope, too afraid to resist. An elderly woman broke down as she admitted to paying hundreds she couldn't afford, terrified of being arrested in her own living room. The stories varied, but the pattern was the same: intimidation, coercion, exploitation. The courtroom became a chorus of voices, each one adding to the weight of evidence against the president. The defense tried to spin a different narrative. They painted the president as a dedicated volunteer, a woman burdened by the responsibility of holding a failing neighborhood together. They argued that the uniforms were symbolic, that the fines were community contributions, that the threats were exaggerated. But the words fell flat. Against the mountain of evidence, the defense's story sounded less like justification and more like denial. When it was my turn, I spoke not as a neighbor, but as an investigator. I explained the mechanics of control, the psychology of fear, the way authority had been manufactured and weaponized. I connected the dots between financial records and personal testimonies, and though I kept my tone professional, I made sure the jury understood what this had been. Not a misunderstanding, not overzealousness, but a deliberate fraud designed to exploit an entire community. The president herself eventually took the stand. Her performance was polished, every word carefully chosen. She spoke of long nights spent worrying about property values, of neighbors who refused to comply, of her desperate attempts to maintain order. She painted herself as a victim, misunderstood, vilified, punished for caring too much. Her voice broke at the right moments, her eyes glistened with practiced tears, but if her words moved anyone, it wasn't enough. The prosecution dismantled her testimony with precision, confronting her with documents, receipts, and contradictions. Each denial was met with evidence. Each attempt to shift blame was countered with hard facts. The performance cracked, and beneath it lay the truth: entitlement, greed, and obsession. After days of testimony, the case went to the jury. The courtroom sat in silence as they deliberated. Hours stretched into an eternity, tension thick in the air. Neighbors who had once avoided one another now sat side by side, united by anticipation. Even those who still supported the president sat nervously, sensing the inevitability of what was to come. When the jury returned, the verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all major counts: fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, harassment, extortion. The words fell like hammer blows, stripping away the last remnants of her illusion. The president stood motionless as the verdict was read. For the first time, her posture faltered. Her shoulders sagged, her face paled, her hands trembled. The performance was over. The queen of the cul-de-sac had been dethroned not by rebellion, but by justice. The sentence was not severe compared to the crimes I had seen in my career, but it was fitting. Fines, restitution, probation, mandatory community service. The restitution hit hardest. Every dollar she had taken was to be repaid. For a woman who had built her identity on control and superiority, the humiliation of being reduced to a criminal record and financial debt was punishment enough. The neighborhood, however, was not healed overnight. The trial had ended, but the damage remained. Trust was fractured, friendships strained, property values shaken. Some families put their houses up for sale, unwilling to remain in a place that had become synonymous with scandal. Others stayed, determined to rebuild, to reclaim the community from the shadow of its fallen ruler. The Loyalists, stripped of their leader, dissolved into silence. The flyers disappeared, the vandalism stopped, the whispered threats faded. Without the president's command, their power evaporated. They returned to anonymity, their attempts at defiance reduced to nothing more than awkward waves from across the street. For me, the trial's conclusion brought not triumph, but reflection. I had seen entitlement and control destroy lives before, but never so close to home. It was a reminder that power, even in its pettiest forms, can corrupt completely. The fake HOA police had been laughable in their costumes, but the fear they had inflicted was real. The damage they had done was real. In the months that followed, the neighborhood slowly found its balance. A new, legitimate HOA board was formed, not self-appointed, not authoritarian, but elected transparently by residents. Their first act was to abolish the old system of fines and replace it with voluntary guidelines. Their second act was to hold a block party, not as a show of control, but as a gesture of healing. For the first time in years, neighbors gathered not out of fear, but out of choice. Children played, families talked, laughter replaced whispers. It wasn't perfect, neighborhoods never are, but it was real. And that was enough. As for the former president, she faded into obscurity. Her name became a cautionary tale, spoken in hushed tones or laughed about over barbecues. Some said she had moved away, unable to bear the humiliation. Others claimed she still lived nearby, hiding behind drawn curtains. But whether she was present or gone, her reign was over. Standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun set over the rows of houses, I thought about the strange journey we had taken. What had begun as a petty power trip had escalated into a community-wide drama, a legal battle, and a viral story. And though the neighborhood would never forget, it had survived. That was the lesson I realized. Entitlement may roar, control may posture, fear may spread, but in the end, truth has a way of cutting through the noise. And when the curtain falls, even the loudest voices cannot drown out the verdict of reality. The fake HOA police had come to arrest me. But in the end, it was their leader who stood convicted, exposed not by spectacle, but by the simple persistence of truth. And with that, the story closed. And that's how the fake HOA police tried to arrest me, but ended up getting exposed in court instead. Entitlement might think it can wear a badge, but in the end, the truth always pulls rank. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me, what would you do if the HOA police showed up at your door?